Welcome to this topic video on CSS Grid. CSS Grid layout, we should be saying. Our learning objectives are to get familiar with some of the vast capabilities of grid layout, to get you familiar with the terminology, and enable you to use grid for a wide variety of purposes. Okay? It can seem a little overwhelming, but there's very simple uses, and then you get more elaborate uses and such like that. So I'll give you some examples of things from whole page layout to just layouts of subsections of pages. Like Flexbox, we can put grid. We can put Flexbox within Flexbox. We can put grids within grids and build things up as we need to. Good readings. Okay, MDM Grid. From Mozilla, great stuff. The complete grid guide, you do want to go here. This has got all the terminology. It's got some really good reference, and it's got some nice examples of some things that are pretty amazing that you can do with grid. And of course, what would be a layout technique without a nice game to go with it? So go to Grid Garden, where you'll write CSS code to grow your carrot garden and such like that. So that's a fun place to practice grid. Okay. Now I've got practice pages. Well, or in here are linked to practice pages. One is from MDN. Okay, we're going to use that for some basic demos. Then I've got one for complete page layout using grid with named grid items. Okay, then I have another one where I demonstrate form layout. Okay, so I've got these already ready to go to open. Okay, so what is it? It's a 2D, two-dimensional rows and columns layout technique. We said way back when we first introduced the idea of CSS layout that grid and the idea of using grids to lay out items on a page goes back to the beginning of the written word. Okay, so the concept of a two-dimensional layout system goes back way far. Okay, so let's take a quick look. So what do we have? We have rows going horizontally. We have row gaps or gutters between gutters between rows when we have multiple rows. We have columns, and we have, let me make this a little bit more visible. We have gutters or column gaps between columns. Okay. So we're used to that rows and columns, horizontal and vertical layout. Okay, we get both. So let's take a look at this example file. Okay. Grid starting point. Okay, there's no grid on this. Okay, so let's see. Here's our div. It contains a bunch of separate divs, each styled slightly. What do they get? Sorry. Each one of these divs, border radius, padding, background color, border color, etc. Okay, then we've got the total div out here, container. Doesn't have any particular styling at all itself. Okay, not there yet. Okay, nothing magical going on here yet. Okay, let's apply grid to the container. What? We use display property. Okay, just like we did with Flexbox. Okay, so we set display. We're not going to set it to block. We're not going to set it to flex. We're going to set it to grid. Professor, nothing happened. Well, the default for grid is one column. So let's go to grid, template, columns, and set up some columns. How about 200 pixels? Well, there's one narrow column. 200 pixels. 200 pixels. Wow, that easy. Okay, we're able to lay out things in columns of 3 columns. Okay, and it just filled in until we needed it. Nice, super nice. Okay. Oh, we tried that. Good. Now, what kind of unit should you use? Well, if I'm doing stuff where these things are mostly holding text, I would probably use REMs, R-E-M or E-M units, because then I kind of know how wide they are in terms of characters, right? If I'm doing images and stuff like that, I might use pixels like I did here. There are some new units, okay, which is the FR unit, which takes a fraction of the space, okay? So here we're going to give an example here. We're going to try going 1FR, 1FR, 2FR. Okay, so let's try changing here. 1FR. Oops, I said 1FR. Nothing happening, Professor. 1FR. Okay, we got 2 columns. 2FR. Oh, notice how they take up all the space, and the last column is twice as wide as the first 2. Another nifty thing about these units is they scale they're responsive in the terminology. Okay, they scale as the width scales. Okay, because they are fractions of the available space. Now you're saying, Professor, these are kind of ugly because they're all smashed together. So why don't we try adding grid column gap? Yep, it does just what you think it might. Let's make it 1M. Okay. Professor, but the rows are all crammed together. Yep. Grid row gap. I'm just making up these numbers just to give you examples, but look, that nice and simple, adjustable, scalable. I didn't have to specify anything on these individual elements. I just specified it on the container, like we saw with Flexbox. We have properties we're going to put on containers. Then we're going to have properties we can put on the things in the containers, the items. Okay? Pretty neat. Okay, but look at that. Only 3 lines of CSS gives us that neat of a layout. Okay, 4 lines. I miscounted. Okay, so don't be intimidated. I know it's got all this power. Just go to that reference guide at CSS Strict and you go, oh, it's so much. No, it's really not that bad. Okay, now let's get an idea of all the things you can do with it. Okay, don't expect you to remember all this. This is the stuff to look up. Okay, so we're going to go through terminology and then some capabilities. Okay. So in terminology, like in Flexbox, we've got the container and the items. Okay, the grid container is the thing that we apply display grid to. Okay, the things within that grid container will be laid out as we specify rather than in the normal flow. The items are the direct children, direct descendants of the grid container. Doesn't apply to children within children, just the direct descendants. What you choose to do within each of the children is up to you. That's what I said. You can put grids within grids or grids within Flexbox. It's okay. Okay. You can't put grid and Flexbox on the same thing. Okay. Now we have grids, so we can talk about grid lines. Okay. And we're going to use those because they get numbered and we can use them to indicate where things might start or stop. Okay, grid lines. Okay, column. We can have column and row grid lines. Okay, we can talk about a grid track, the space between grid lines. Okay, just basic terminology. Grid track. Okay, grid cell, the smallest unit that you can apply stuff to. Okay, the space between adjacent grid lines. Okay, columns and row grid lines. All this stuff you're kind of familiar about. You've seen spreadsheets with cells and such like that. Okay, grid area. Oh, a group of space surrounded by 4 grid lines. Okay, notice it's rectangular. You can't get weird stuff with missing chunks out of it. Okay, grid areas. Okay, now we're going to get into properties for the containers and the items. Okay, we define grid systems, as we saw in our example here, with things like grid template columns and grid template Yes, we can do rows. Okay, so how high should we set the first row? How about 10 VH? We'll set the second row to 30 VH, make it really fun. We'll set that last row to, I don't know, 5 VH. What's VH? Those are the viewport units of the browser, right? We had VH is the viewport height. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. Viewport height. So these things shrink as the viewport height and width shrinks. Okay, so we were able to set row heights, define our rows. We had 1, 2, 3 rows, and we could specify the heights on those things using whatever type of units we want. Okay, so that's how we define grid systems. Grid and template columns. If you don't specify the rows, all the rows will look the same, okay, based on whatever default type of properties. Okay. Notes. You can assign names for later use to grid lines. Otherwise, you can use them as far as numbers go. Okay. Numbers, Professor? Oh, look over here. In our development tools, overlay grid. It will show us the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Gotcha. Okay, these tools are very helpful. They will show us things like this now. We didn't have these before, so we had to use just background colors and stuff like that, but these tools are wonderful, as you have heard me explain before. Okay? Makes it a lot easier to place things when you can see the numbers. Okay. Okay, we can set the gaps, grid row gap, grid gaps, and all sorts of things like that. Okay. We can use grid template areas, property defined areas, and give them names. We're going to see that in an example coming up. Now, here's in Flexbox, we kind of had this principal access and things like that. In a grid, we have column access and row access. Okay. For each box we get, cell in the grid, we can choose how we align things. Okay. When we're talking about the container, we can set up how things align along the in-row axis. Okay. So that would be the horizontal axis as opposed to the vertical. Okay. Justify items applies to the horizontal row axis. Okay. A picture looks like this. These things aren't as wide necessarily as their containers. Okay. So when we tell them to center, we center them. Can we justify the different size? Yes, we can. This is the default that we set on the container. Okay. Align items. This is for the not a cross axis anymore. This is for the column axis, okay? Up and down, vertical. What does that look like? Okay, here's an example of line items end. Okay, these pictures are from CSS Tricks. I like to go there because I don't remember align or justify. Align items, justify it gets me confused. No, go over to CSS Tricks, look at the pictures, and remind myself that, oh, align items deals with vertical positioning within the boxes. Okay, so here it's set to end, so things are set to the bottom. Okay, we can do center, we can do stretch, we can do all these different values. Okay, we'll illustrate this. Okay, we'll get a chance to play with this. Okay, so this is how we deal with extra space. Okay, we got stretch, we got center, we got all those things. Okay, so we got justify content, align content with values start, end, center, stretch, space around, space between, space evenly. Good stuff. Okay. Now, we can specify where an item starts. Grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, grid row end. Both allow the use of span indicator for items taking up multiple cells. Okay. Do I remember all the syntax of each one of these? No. Okay. Now, if you're talking about the grid item, you can override any of these items, okay, by saying justify self. So this you do on the grid item, not on a grid container, or align self. Okay, so we can override those things. So let's try putting this into use. Now this is a page layout example. Okay, this is like if you're designing an app or a website in general and you want to specify the whole layout of the page. What's going to happen? Well, lots of things could happen. I didn't mean to do that. What I meant to do is, suppose you're working with the designer and they say, you know, I want you to lay things out with the header above, main content here, some space here. I don't know if we might want to break this up in extra pieces. I want some kind of footer and stuff like that. It's like, okay, but I'm not sure. Oh, you mean you need flexibility? Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my containers and the items. I'm going to set up a body, which is going to be my grid container. Then I'm going to have, and remember, only direct descendants can be grid items. So I'm going to use a nav for that little menu that they were suggesting. Remember, they kind of wanted a nav on the side. Okay, they wanted a header on top, main, and stuff like that. But they may change their minds. Okay, this is design. You never know what may happen. Graphic design. I am not a designer of that type. Okay, so I'm going to use nav, header, and main. Okay, what does that look like? Here's my body. I've got a nav in it. I've got a header in it. I've got a main in it. And I've got a footer. Okay. If I come over here, I threw it. There's a little bit of styling, but there's no whatever. You're going, Professor, this thing's on top. Oh, that's right. Nav, header, main. This is the order they appear. Okay. Not necessarily the order that we're going to put them in. And all these things are block elements. So by default, they're as wide as their container and they're as tall as they need to be for their content. Okay. Now, how do we work with this? Let's get rid of. I don't want to get rid of that. How do we work with this? I want to potentially be able to reorder and move things around. Okay. So I'm going to, in this example, you don't have to use this in general. You can use grid numbering. So I'm going to use the grid area property to give names to the items for use and placement. Then I'm going to use the grid template areas. Okay, this is more like I said, this is advanced properties of the grid for this layout purpose. My layout, not necessarily beautiful or anything, okay? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the areas names, the items, the grid items names, and then I'm going to specify where they go using this grid template areas property. Professor, you mean yes? Okay, in my CSS, okay, I say grid area, and I give it a name. That's it. This header is going to be my title block. Okay, back to that design I was given. The footer, I'm going to give it a name of closing. Okay, but Professor, it's already called a footer. Yeah. This is for layout with grid template area. Okay, and my nav, I'm going to just call it a menu. This is kind of redundant, Professor. Don't worry, we're getting there. Okay, there is a payoff. Okay, so right now we've got each item. If I look at it, oh, grid area menu, header, grid area title block. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set up the container. I want you to look at this. Okay, grid template areas. Now, what is this? Okay, yes, I know it's text. Dot title block, title block. Oh, let's take a look at the grid template columns. We have 1, 2, 3 columns. We have 3 entries in this text. A dot, which is going to mean nothing goes in that block. Title block means the named area title block is going to take up these 2 slots in the first row. Oh, so we're kind of graphically representing this like a matrix of where we want to put the items. Yes. Oh, and so to change that around, we just have to move these guys around? Yes, we're going to see that in a second. Okay. Look, I'm taking up 1, 2, 3, 4 slots, 4 squares for the content. I'm using the bottom row all across for closing. Okay. What are my rows? Let's see. I got grid template row. The first one has auto height, meaning it'll take the auto. Okay. Then the second one, I want 30 viewport height, 40 viewport height, and then auto. Okay, I'm putting some gaps in there. I'm putting some gray. Okay, let's go take a look. So now we're going to come over to the body. Oh, look, I have grid all ready to go. I just turned it off. Professor, yes. That's kind of ugly. Yeah. What do you want me to do with it? Well, couldn't you make this go across the entire top? Oh, how would we do that? Let's see, that's the header. Okay, so right now it says here, title block, title block. Title block can go all the way across. So the issue is not with that, it's with the item itself. Oh, look, it says justify self-start. What if I say and? Oh, I can move it there. What if I want to have it go across the entire stretch? Oh, so I can line it up there. Professor, I want this centered. Yeah. Well, they wouldn't be calling me a professor. I'd be working on this project. They'd just say, hey, you, center it. How would I do that? Just text. Text the line. Center. I go, we want this to extend over into that area. Oh, you do you? How do we fix that? Oh, then we go back to the body. Okay, we see that the title block, this first corner here has nothing in it. We put a dot. Let's go and edit that. Everything goes away. Title block. Oh, cool. We can fix this. We want to have this menu take up more space. In parallel, this side of the box. Oh, okay. How do we fix that? Well, let's see, where's the menu? Menu only goes from this, it's only during this one, so if we want it to extend downward, we need to put something menu here. Okay. Is that wonderful? We'd like this to go across the entire bottom. Well, it is going across the entire bottom. Oh, let's go to the footer and see what it says. Back, justify self is center. We could go to end. We could go to stretch. Oh, is this what they want? I don't know, but it's easy to change things. Could we move the menu and put it up here? Yeah. All we have to do is change this template areas and decide where we want to put the blocks. This is the payoff to having the named areas. Now, can my tools help me? Yeah. So I go and look at my display grid, I can see this is where things are laid out right now. Even when I had my footer centered so it wasn't taking up the entire bottom, okay, I could see that closing, the area was reserved for closing. How I use that area for closing was up to me, okay? Just like I can see this area is all reserved for menu. Okay, so the tools can help us illustrate what we see in this grid template areas. Okay, so this is the kind of thing I would use grid for when I'm planning an entire layout. Okay, I would not go to all this effort in other situations. Why? Because we can specify the locations of items, okay, by using line numbers and things like that. That's why the line number property is here. Okay, so if I turn off area names, okay, I got the line number still. If I turn off the line numbers, we still see the grid rows and columns. Okay, very nice. Okay, just an example. Okay, please, I was not showing my styling as an example of anything beautiful. Okay, just a starting point. Okay. What's another application? One that we have to do a lot. Forms, okay? We come up with forms, whether we're talking about classic HTML forms or just a bunch of inputs, labels, various different control types, input types that we're using in an app. Let me just show you the complete image. Okay, so we want something neat and clean and tidy like this. Where do we start? With something like this, a mess. Okay, here I got labels, I got inputs. They don't care where they are, they're just sitting there. Okay, all right. No structure here. Here I have a section. I've got label, input, label, input, label, input. I do have a regular pattern, label, select, label, text area, button. Okay, so I've got lots of structure there in the terms of nice. We just have, okay, but what we don't have is it doesn't look good. Okay. Remember, all these examples are referenced from the text, from the slides, so you can get them, open them up, and putz with them with your dev tools. Okay, so I've got a lot of labels, input buttons. They've got a regular structure because they're just, we're setting up a form. Okay, I'm going to order the elements in my HTML. That I'm going to make rigorous. And I'm not going to give each element a grid area name or anything complicated like that. Okay, so we saw the application form. It does have lots of structure. Label, input, label, input. Okay, label, label select, label blah. Okay, So now what I'm going to do, okay, that's what we're starting with. Let's start putting some, okay, let's put on grid. Okay, the default for a grid is a single column. It's not quite what we want, but that could work on the cell phone. Now, let's add columns. Simple 2 columns. I am using, look over here, I am using, because this is inputs and these are text type of things, I'm using text type units, M's or rounds. You should use one or the other, not both in combination. Okay, so we get some niceness. But everything's smashed together. What I'm going to do, give it some row gap. Okay. Oops, there's one thing that should not be seen yet. Let's turn off we haven't talked about, we'll see this one in a sec, but before we get all that, let's see it's in progress. Okay, so I'm commenting out this one piece. Okay, so this is where we're at. Okay, everything starts out left justified. Okay, grid column gap. So I add some gaps. Okay, so that's looking neat and tidy. So that's been all done with the container. And this looks pretty good with no extra HTML. I did not need to put in lots of extra divs. In the old days and even currently, using grid systems from frameworks a lot of times involve putting in a lot of extra divs for each row, each column, and all sorts of stuff. Okay. Now, and we saw this was very simple. Okay. Display grid. Okay, we pick out the container. Which is the container? Okay, we do that in our, okay, that's part of our layout, or part of our design. All right. So this was all this stuff was in a section. Okay, so sometimes I'll say controls or whatever. I gave it an ID in this case. An application. This is the application section. I put all my controls in here. Okay. And in a regular way. Then I could apply grid very simply without having to worry about it, because there can be a lot of controls in here. I have to name each one and such. Not worthwhile, but look how quickly we're able to set things up. But this requires cooperation in the structuring of our HTML. Okay. Now you're going, Professor, what about these names? Don't we want them over here? Yeah. How do we do that? We were working with the container. Now we want to work with the items. Okay. This is the general layout for the container. Okay. So let's go to double check. Let's fix the labels so they are right aligned. Okay. So how am I going to do that? Let's go to our CSS style editor. Down here in the bottom, application label. So only for the labels within the application section. Okay. Look here. Justify self end. So let's remove the comments. So what we just did was change the properties of these items within the container. Did I do it one at a time? No, I used a selector to select all the labels because I wanted to modify them all. Okay. So we see grid, our application. Let's take a look and see things. Okay. So this is a lot simpler layout. can see all our line numbers, but look at all those rows. Okay. We don't have any area names here. Okay. But we can see our gaps, our row gaps or row columns here. Okay. And we can change things as we go. Very, very clean. Okay. Compared to what we had to do this kind of thing just a couple years ago, this is so much nicer, so much easier. Okay, a lot of the newest CSS frameworks, that styling frameworks are coming out. They started dropping grid systems because Grid, the new CSS Grid layout, does it all and better than the other tricks that people were doing to come up with grids. Okay, so that was an overview of CSS Grid. Okay, we've got the container, we've got the items, we've got control over placement if we want it. We've got control over, we have control over ordering, placement, justification, stretching, all sorts of good things. This is just a glimpse of all the power of it. Go to the references to see a bit more, okay, and use it.